Howdy, y'all, and welcome back to the Conspiracy Farm. Today we're talking about death by aliens. Everybody likes a good alien encounter story. Everybody likes a good murder mystery. So when you combine both, you end up with something very special. It's like the chocolate and peanut butter of conspiracy theories. Are there actual records of hostile encounters between humans and non-human intelligence, aka aliens? Apparently the answer is yes. Today we're going to be talking about two different stories. One case occurred in New Mexico in 1956. The incident was apparently swept under the rug to maintain secrecy and to avoid a general panic. The other incident occurred in Russia before the fall of the Soviet Union, but as we'll see, it's a bit of a shaky claim. There are some strange circumstances and shady details about that story. We're also going to overthink some of the details in these stories, and we're actually going to match it to the mystery of cattle mutilation and another strange incident that occurred 3,000 years ago. Okay, so let's check it out. Let's move on to the incident from 1956. This incident is supposedly recorded in report number 13 of a multi-volume report called Project Grudge, which was commissioned by the United States Air Force in the late 1940s to investigate whether UFOs posed a national security threat. They concluded that they did not. However, the Defense Department started another investigation shortly after Grudge ended. This new one was a lot longer and more in-depth and more famous. It's called Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book was a massive investigation by the United States government into reports of UFOs. It lasted from 1951 to 1969. Project Blue Book is actually the originator for a lot of the terminology used in ufology, which is the study of UFOs. For example, you may have heard of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, both a type of alien incident, but also a movie from the late 70s. Steven Spielberg did a lot of research before doing that movie, and those are classifications that were invented by the United States Air Force and were used to classify incidents in Project Blue Book. So a close encounter of the first kind would mean a close-up sighting of a UFO, an object just in the sky. It didn't do anything, didn't say anything, didn't land anywhere. That's the first kind. Close encounters of the second kind involve some sort of physical interaction with the world around the craft, either landing or burning trees, causing radiation burns to witnesses. That occurs. I don't know about often, but it does appear to happen more than once. Close encounters of the third kind, the most famous kind, thanks to that movie, involves interactions with NHI. When they actually leave the craft and you see something either unusually small or super tall with giant eyes, the whole standard rigmarole. Now, in Project Blue Book, there are only three different classifications. Ufologists and pop culture moved on to invent encounters of the fourth kind, which involve forceful abduction, and close encounters of the fifth kind, which are human-initiated contact with NHI using mass meditation. I know someone who is affiliated with one of these groups, and I will be trying what they call the CE5 protocol, the Close Encounter of the Fifth Kind protocol, which involves a group of people going out to the middle of nowhere to do meditation to see if they could summon an orb or a UFO. I will be doing this soon, and of course I'll be bringing a lot of cameras. Now, there's another government project that involves the color blue. Some people say that blue is a very secret code word for the program or the deep state connection with NHI. And that leads us to a mythical project called Project Bluebeam, which either does exist or it's a disinformation campaign or some kind of psychological operation against ufologists or people who are digging through too much information. Project Bluebeam supposedly is the plan to create a general panic through creating a perception in the general public that an alien invasion is imminent. And the reasoning there is that the public would willingly vote for larger budgets and more power granted to the military-industrial complex in order for humans to be able to defend themselves. I don't know if I buy this at all. It might be some carefully crafted story from the 1980s. As you can see, a lot of this stuff goes way back. Now, supposedly, Project Grudge was declassified. That's how we know about it. Mostly declassified, strangely enough. You can find reports 1 through 12. They were declassified. You can also find report number 14, but no report 13. Can't find report 13 anywhere. And I don't think the federal government has a practice of skipping the number 13 to avoid bad luck. Well, why can't we read number 13? It's not surprising that it was not declassified given its supposed content. Grudge Report 13 describes the apparent disturbing murder of an Air Force sergeant named Jonathan Lovett in 1956. And this occurred on the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. Where else? Of course, New Mexico. Epicenter of our connection with NHI for whatever reason. As you'll see, the purpose behind White Sands and what Sergeant Lovett was doing there may have contributed to why this grisly accident went down. So what does Grudge Report 13 say? Apparently, in March of 1956, an Air Force sergeant named Jonathan Lovett was assisting Major William Cunningham on the White Sands Missile Testing Grounds near Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. Now, this was a unit that was testing nuclear weapons, and there's our first connection with other NHI incidents. As you'll see, the NHI are very, very concerned with human use of nuclear weapons. It's no accident that a lot of these strange events and interactions started in the late 1940s after humans began using nuclear weapons. And it turns out the NHI tend to get very touchy and defensive when it comes to contexts where nuclear weapons are being tested or might be used. So Major Cunningham and Sergeant Lovett were in the desert outside the base late at night. Obviously, the report doesn't feel the need to go into extreme detail about what they were testing, but apparently there was some scattered debris in the desert from a recent rocket test that these two were investigating for whatever reason. They got out of the Jeep, both parted ways in the desert, looking for material. Major Cunningham says that they were separated by a shallow dune so that Cunningham couldn't see Lovett directly. But then he heard Lovett screaming. Major Cunningham said that his first thought was that Lovett had been bitten by a rattlesnake. But when Cunningham turned around and ran up the dune and saw over it, in the report he claims that he saw Sergeant Lovett being dragged by a long serpentine arm that was wrapped around his leg. He said that this long arm connected to a silver disc that was hovering in the air no more than 20 feet above the ground. He said that this arm pulled Lovett into the craft, then the craft rose vertically into the sky and zipped away. Well, according to the report, Major Cunningham returned to the base and he reported all of this immediately, and he was promptly confined to the base hospital. Base personnel confirmed that there was an unidentified radar contact near Holloman Air Force Base at the time that Lovett vanished. The unit sent out search parties into the desert to look for evidence or remains, and they couldn't find any, at least not for 3 days. We'll come back to the story and we will talk about how they discovered Sergeant Lovett's body and the condition it was in. But the first thing we need to do is talk a little bit more about Holloman Air Force Base. Now, if we're going to talk about Holloman Air Force Base, we need to talk about a small-town sheriff from New Mexico named Lonnie Zamora. Now, Lonnie Zamora never made a dime from his story, but he claims that he encountered a craft that was landed on the ground in a small ravine outside of Socorro, New Mexico in 1964, and that date will be important. He described what's now called a Tic Tac, a smallish, pill-shaped white craft, smooth, sometimes described as having what looks like little pitot tubes coming out of the bottom. Zamora described a red insignia that was printed on the side of the craft. He said that he saw two short-looking individuals in silver jumpsuits next to the craft. And when they saw him, they immediately got into the craft and left. Zamora was interviewed by Dr. Hynek, who was the technical advisor for Project Blue Book. So yes, the Air Force talked to Sheriff Zamora. Dr. Hynek said that Zamora's account was very credible. Zamora took them out to the ravine where he saw the craft. Now, some people say that this was all a lot of condescension on the part of Dr. Hynek because he already knew what craft Zamora had seen. There are a lot of stories about these white Tic Tacs and who makes them and where they come from. I actually am leaning toward the fact that these were built by Lockheed Martin. Other people say they are reverse engineered craft. I noticed that Zamora said that when the vehicle rose up from the ground that it was ejecting heat. Apparently there were some burned material around where the craft was. That sounds like human technology to me. In general, NHI technology does not emit heat. Enormous amounts of light often, but not heat. Hot stuff generally belongs to humans. These Tic Tacs are the same devices that are seen by Navy pilots who have testified to this to Congress. Strangely enough, once again, here we have NHI clustering around nuclear assets, and these Navy pilots fly on carriers that are nuclear powered. Now, why is Zamora important? Ufologists suggest that this craft was part of an embassy of NHI that met with humans at Holloman Air Force Base in 1964. Now, there's no indication that Lyndon Baines Johnson or John F. Kennedy ever met an alien. No indication that the president was involved. No one from Congress went to the Air Force Base to shake hands with an alien. So we have to assume that if it did occur, these were what could be described as deep state representatives that met with the NHI on our behalf. That's so nice of them. I'm sure they had our best interests at heart. So these were not elected people. Apparently, an actual film of the NHI arrival at Holloman exists. And they were grays, meaning they were about 4 feet tall, large black eyes, very thin, silver jumpsuits. Mouths could move slightly, but they communicated through telepathy, apparently. A very similar embassy event happened in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets' film footage actually leaked out a bit in 1989 after the fall of the Soviet Union. So we have probably our best video footage of an actual NHI. Unfortunately, it is a VHS recording using a camcorder in the 90s, pointed at a screen where an old black and white film from the 50s or 60s was being projected. If you want to find the footage, you can get on YouTube and search for Skinny Bob. Ufologists named the guy Skinny Bob because he's very, very thin. And if this is CGI, you have to allow for that possibility, except you have to remember that Skinny Bob dates back to the 2000s. CGI wasn't that great back then, and we definitely didn't have any publicly available AI. Now, Eisenhower was supposedly the last American president who had any direct contact with NHI. Like I said, I've never come across anything that would make me think that JFK or LBJ had any connection to this. It does appear that Nixon may have seen some of the recovered materials, including a body. There are numerous accounts of this, and Nixon was apparently read into the program more than any other president except maybe Ronald Reagan. And George H.W. Bush probably knew the most after Eisenhower because of his connection with the CIA. Well, enough about Holloman Air Force Base, but we can see that this part of New Mexico is extremely important, and it involves a lot of interaction between humans and NHI. This may have been one unfortunate one-off event in what is otherwise a fruitful relationship, I hope. I guess we may never know what happened at that meeting because, as I said, there were no elected officials there, unfortunately. Now, back to the unfortunate Sergeant Lovett. The Air Force searched for Sergeant Lovett's body for 3 days, and they found it after 3 days, 10 miles from the site where Major Cunningham said that the incident happened. Lovett's body was found nude, and he had been mutilated using very neat surgical cuts as if with a laser. His tongue had been removed from the lower portion of his jaw. His eyes had been removed. His anus and genitalia had been, quote, neatly extracted like a plug, end quote. In addition, his body had been completely drained of blood. This person did not bleed to death. It's almost as if the blood was removed by magic or beamed out of the body, Star Trek style. So whatever happened was violent, precise, and presumably fast, hopefully. But what was the purpose of that? Why would the injuries be like this, especially if we're dealing with a civilization that has weapons that can put thoughts in people's minds or defy gravity or maybe even time in some cases? Why would they do this? And that leads us to another very strange topic. It's one of those that no one talks about because it just sounds crazy when you say it out loud. But Sergeant Lovett's injuries are strangely similar to cattle mutilations. We're going to do a whole episode on these. It's a huge topic, and it has been going on for a long time all over the world. This is a serious problem for ranchers out west and in the Southwest in particular. When this occurs, farmers say that scavengers won't touch the carcasses. And what do you know? The carcasses have their genitals, anus, eyes, and tongue removed, usually. The blood is gone. Sometimes there's a strange ammonia smell reported. There are ranchers who have talked to news outlets saying that they're quitting ranching and selling their land because they were losing hundreds of head of cattle over the last years, and local law enforcement didn't do anything. They just said, look, it's coyotes or mountain lions. You know, this kind of thing happens. So if this is connected to NHI, why do they go around doing this to cattle? Well, the apparent purpose behind it involves some understanding of how the NHI produce themselves and feed themselves. And we'll talk about that later, but just know that bovine blood serum is used in certain genetic experiments. Also, apparently the NHI can only consume a thick brown paste that is full of iron, copper, electrolytes, and sugar. And it may be the case that this material is best extracted from tissue that is heavy in nerve endings, and that explains exactly why they take the body parts that they do. There's a strange, brutish efficiency in NHI behavior. Apparently, they can, quote-unquote, manifest materials, think of a super advanced 3D printing that can read thoughts from your head and then produce what you want instantaneously. Apparently, they have devices that can do this in certain bases under the ocean and maybe underground in certain areas, but they can't do this sort of thing inside their little crafts. We're going to do a whole episode about Air Force officers who multiple times have testified to Congress about UFOs shutting down or interfering with nuclear assets at missile silos. So we'll talk more about that. The Sergeant Lovett case is not the only case of cattle mutilation type tactics being used on humans. There's a strange incident that happened in northern Russia in 1959. They call it the Dyatlov Pass incident. It involved some Russian students, some of which were studying nuclear physics. I don't know if that's a coincidence, but while on a hiking expedition, during a time when people reported seeing UFOs in the area, the students disappeared and were later found with crushing injuries to many of their body parts as if they had been dropped, one medical examiner said. Dropped from a tall height. Some of the bodies were radioactive slightly. Multiple hikers had their tongues and or eyes removed. Now, researchers have come up with a lot of explanations for these injuries. They've come up with elaborate scenarios that involve special types of avalanches, hypothermia, an animal attack, a human attack, or even strange decisions made through mental impairment due to carbon monoxide poisoning, because of a heater they were using in their tent. Sure, all of those are possibilities, I think. In general, when you look at someone who's been injured and you say, well, I think aliens did it, that's always going to be inherently unlikely, especially given human behavior. So no, I'm not saying that I think the Dyatlov Pass incident was definitely humans being killed by aliens for some reason. But we don't know what happened to those people, and those injuries were very strange. Also, 1959 in the Soviet Union, 1956 in the United States. We also don't know, especially from the Soviet government, exactly what these students were involved in. So it's hard to speculate about the motivations when there is almost certainly a lot of secrecy surrounding that. As a lot of you guys may know, 1959 was at the very darkest moment of the Cold War. Late 50s, early 60s were extremely intense. Okay, moving on to another incident. This was something that I've seen recently, and it popped up on Reddit, X, YouTube, and the internet in general. It was a release of confidential files from the CIA. And in one of these files, there is a communique about a lethal encounter with aliens in the Soviet Union. Now, it's not clear exactly when the incident happened. Definitely 20th century, because it appears that the document that leaked was from 2000. So the date is unclear, but it appears to be before then. This was, the CIA found out about this incident apparently from KGB records that leaked in 1991 when the Soviet Union fell. And I talked about that earlier in relation to Skinny Bob. Now, I got to say, I'm not impressed with the memo. What I saw was written in all caps, on lined paper, crooked photocopy. Now, this is the kind of thing that you would see in the 90s, even early 2000s, but there are some typos and strange comments. The story had been published in what is essentially a tabloid from the 90s. Now, it is the case that a lot of tabloid stories have partial truths in them. Another strange thing is that at the very end, you'll notice that the AI voice that will read the text of this document referred to a person's organism being affected or damaged, but I do believe he means internal organs. So to me, this incident is not nearly as credible as the Air Force incident, but it does have a very fascinating element. The nature of the injuries was quite different. This was not a mutilation case. This relates to something from myth and legend, something that happened a long time ago that was strangely similar. Let's see what the CIA agent has to say.
According to the KGB materials, a quite low-flying spaceship in the shape of a saucer appeared above a military unit that was conducting routine training maneuvers. For unknown reasons, somebody unexpectedly launched a surface-to-air missile and hit the UFO. It fell to Earth, not far away, and 5 short humanoids with large heads and large black eyes emerged from it. It is stated in the testimonies by the 2 soldiers who remained alive that after freeing themselves from the debris, the aliens came close together and then merged into a single object that acquired a spherical shape. That object began to buzz and hiss sharply and then became brilliant white. In a few seconds, the spheres grew much bigger and exploded by flaring up with an extremely bright light. At that very instant, 23 soldiers who had watched the phenomenon turned into stone poles. Only 2 soldiers who stood in the shade and were less exposed to the luminous explosion survived. The KGB report goes on to say that the remains of the UFO and the petrified soldiers were transferred to a secret scientific research institution near Moscow. Specialists assume that a source of energy that is still unknown to Earthlings instantly changed the structure of the soldiers' living organisms, having transformed it into a substance whose molecular composition is no different from that of limestone. A CIA representative stated, quote, "If the KGB file corresponds to reality, this is an extremely menacing case The aliens possess such weapons and technology that go beyond all our assumptions. They can stand up for themselves if attacked.
Well, that's a wild yarn if I ever heard one. Stone poles. In that one part where the individual aliens from the downed craft fused together into an orb, that sounds completely nuts, but other people have seen that happen in wildly varied incidents. It's hard not to imagine something like that in your head and not think of magic or something like that, but the famous science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke said that any sufficiently advanced technology will be indistinguishable from magic. And we definitely appear to have some advanced technology here, if this story has any basis in fact. Stone poles. That sounds familiar. Someone being turned into a stone pole. Another word for pole, especially one with the diameter of a human body, might be described as a pillar. And salt, it's a mineral. I don't know that it's classified as a stone. I'm not a geologist, but a giant stone pole and a pillar of salt would look fairly similar. Do we have any accounts of humans being turned into pillars of some sort of white mineral? Sounds familiar. Now, some of you may have figured out that I'm talking about the story of Lot's wife during the destruction of Sodom. This story is referred to often. The actual story is very strange, and it doesn't involve what people normally associate with Sodom, at least not specifically. It does indicate that the city was filled with hedonistic psychopaths. The story does seem to center around what the ancient Greeks called xenia, which is rules of hospitality. Lot was a decent family man, and he happened to have two male guests with him staying at his house in Sodom that night. Now, little does anyone know that these two male guests are actually angels. Now, a mob came to Lot's door and demanded that Lot give over the two men to the mob to have their way with them. And Lot was horrified at the idea of violating xenia, so he offered his two daughters to the mob instead. The mob didn't take that deal, and the angels had to use their powers to escape. And that was the final straw. Lot was warned that the city was set for destruction, that angels were going to come and rain fire and brimstone, which is a burning sulfur, onto the city. So, let's hear from the book itself. This is the passage from Genesis that describes the actual turning into a pillar of salt.
When dawn broke, the angels urged Lot on. "To your feet, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city." Then Yahweh rained down on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire of his own sending. He overthrew those cities and the whole plain, with all the people living in the cities, and everything that grew there. But Lot's wife looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. The next morning, Abraham hurried to the place where he had stood before Yahweh, and looking towards Sodom and Gomorrah and the whole area of the plain, he saw the smoke rising from the ground like smoke from a furnace.
Well, that was strange. Do I believe that aliens destroyed Sodom? Well, no. Archaeologists have shown that the city of Sodom was destroyed, and as you guys know, I'm not an expert on the world before the Bronze Age collapse, but we do know that cities were destroyed very often. In ancient Greek, there's actually a one-word term that means to conquer a city, remove everything of value from it, burn the rest of the city to the ground, kill all the male survivors, and take away the female survivors for your own purposes. I do lend some credibility to the Air Force incident. Multiple people that I trust seem to talk about it. The serpentine arm is pretty out there. Normally, you see NHI using beams of light to move things around. So the idea that they need something that dramatic sounds a little strange. But what do I know? We have enough trouble trying to sort through human motivations when it comes to attacks from one human to another. I don't think we should expect NHI motivations to be any less baffling or disturbing. Who knows why they're doing this? They may be the 3D printed product of some faulty AI that crashed under the ocean 4,000 years ago, and we've been the victim of its maladaptive, unreasonable behavior since then. We're going to do an episode on that hypothesis. I call it the von Neumann probe hypothesis. David Grush, when he was asked about the general attitude of NHI toward humans, he answered without hesitation, and I quote, "indifferent at best," end quote. Other sources say that NHI have enormous respect for life in general. It's something that they encourage because it's part of their belief system or their overall motivation for why they're here. So I guess we can take some comfort in that fact. They want more life, not less, but they do not seem to be concerned about individual life. So life in general, yes, but embracing each individual human as a world and a purpose unto itself is not a behavior that people normally see from them. I do notice that all of these incidents have some aspect of either direct self-defense or some connection to nuclear technology, or both. I happen to think that it may be the case that some of the testing being done in the desert that night may have disabled some of the NHI technology and they weren't able to leave the area. I noticed the disc was hovering only 20 feet above the ground. That's unusual for something that can rocket into space in the blink of an eye or fly underwater. So maybe the NHI were afraid for their safety. We'll do an episode in the future that talks about how the NHI apparently don't fear death. They don't think about it the same way we do. That's encouraging because I think they clearly know something about the universe that we don't. So if they're not afraid of death, then maybe that's a good sign. Or maybe I am just severely overthinking all of this. And it's just made up stories, disinformation, old urban legends, back when you actually had to have chemical film photographic evidence. In the days before social media and AI, people were not so easily pushed one way or the other. Well, we'll talk more next time. We will obviously talk a lot more about human NHI interactions and whether they really happened. How do we know that they happened? What's the evidence like? But as you can see, this is a giant, disturbing, strange can of worms that, frustratingly, could be one big psychological operation. The stories are all too interconnected to be just randomly made up, especially when you consider things like aliens walking together bodily and then fusing into a floating orb. How many times is someone going to come up with that same image? It just seems unusual and strange. And then the cattle mutilation injuries are extremely bizarre, and to have those crop up in such very different contexts is just a little strange to me. Makes me think, but maybe I'm just overthinking all of this. Maybe these are just silly stories from way back when, but we'll look more into it, and I'll talk to you next time.